Hello all, Old Geek here, and in this video I will be taking a look at a book that I already covered on a live stream, but as it's a little much to expect most people to want to listen to over 2 hours of me waffling, this is a more condensed and concise version. 1985 saw the release of Unearthed Arcana, the first hardback rules expansion for AD&D. As a British teenager, this was the first official options update for AD&D that was available to me. We were over a decade before the internet. In fact, nearly 2 decades before the internet became ubiquitous and affordable to all. I'd heard of Dragon magazine, but I'd never seen it in any British shops, and I still don't know if a transatlantic subscription was possible, let alone affordable. So I eagerly bought this book when it was released. The cover was by Jeff Easley and was extremely apt, an elderly wizard poring over a tome with laboratory equipment and ingredients all around him. It was captivating and evocative, and I still love it to this day. The page count for the book was pretty typical, 128 pages, with about 60% of those dedicated to player options, and the remaining 40% or so aimed at Dungeon Masters. Internal artwork was somewhat sparse, unfortunately, but what was there was effective, though some of it had been lifted from earlier products. Rather infamously, though, the book had some serious editing issues, typos and omissions. These would be cleaned up in the form of several pages of errata, but of course, being on the other side of the Atlantic, I didn't know this existed until several years ago. It wasn't just the art that was taken from earlier products either. Most of the book's content was taken from Dragon magazine articles. But as I wasn't exposed to Dragon magazine, it was all new to me, so when I was a teenager, I didn't care. The Players section follows the general organisation of the earlier Player's Handbook. We got a new stat in the form of comeliness, new character subraces, various types of elves, dwarves and gnomes. With these came revised race and class options and level limits. That was followed by new character class options, the Cavalier, the Barbarian and the Thief Acrobat. Class adjustments, Paladins moved from being a fighter subclass to being a Cavalier subclass. There were extra levels for Druids and changes to the Ranger. Fighters also got a boost in the form of weapon specialisation. There were new armour types, new weapons and new spells, including the appearance of cantrips for magic users and illusionists, who were a separate class in AD&D. The extra stuff for DMs had its own section towards the back of the book, though how many players who bought this book will have avoided reading the bit that was for DMs only? None. This introduced a new method for generating ability scores called Method 5, followed by more detail on the new classes and new equipment. There was a short section on magic user spellbooks, including the travelling spellbook, and relevant space and costs required by these books. A few bits and bobs about fighting and spellcasting in different environments. And as the Cavalier class incorporated mechanics based on social standing, this was also covered. The largest part of the DM section of Unearthed Arcana focused on new magic items and new versions of the magic item tables. Then came the book's appendices, Weaponless and non-lethal combat, as the rules for all of this in the original Dungeon Master's Guide were somewhat wonky. There were descriptions of non-human deities, and finally the much-needed breakdown of all the polearms in the game. So, with so much new stuff, hopefully it was all thoroughly play-tested. In the preface and introductory passages to the book, Gary Gygax, Jeff Grubb and Kim Mohan gush about the new material, how exciting it all is, how much effort has been put into its creation, testing and editing. In the cold light of day, and with 37 years on which to reflect on it, I think they over-egged it somewhat. Of all the books produced for first edition AD&D, I don't think I'd be wrong to say that Unearthed Arcana is the most variable in its quality. I'll be doing more thorough videos at some point, but for the purpose of this one, I'm just going to summarise the good points and the bad points and not go rambling into the details. I'm just going to focus on the key points. So let's start with the good. The changes to level limits and racial class options are fine. I've got no problems with the cleric class being opened up to other races, for example, because originally they were NPC only. And in reality, multi-classed characters would see very little difference in the tables in this book. Single class characters, though, did get a boost. They're allowed to be 2 levels higher than what is stated, and I would argue that that's a welcome boost. I've got no problem with that at all. The changes to the Ranger were also appropriate, and they were nicely thematic and gave the class a bit more identity. The additions to the list of weapons were interesting too, creating greater variety and in particular options for themed campaigns, as we gained the atlatl, a device for hurling spears. There was the blowgun and the lasso, and also the kopesh, an ancient style of sword. Also worthwhile were the new spells, with some neat and creative additions. Cantrips were, in my opinion, slightly undercooked, but the general idea of them is very good. Perhaps the best part of the book, though, are in the DM section. The information on polearms was an absolute joy. It was useful and it was enlightening. The revision to unarmed combat was an improvement over the Dungeon Master's Guide, but then that wasn't difficult. And the small chapter on social classes was flavourful and would potentially help DMs when crafting a campaign world. And then there's the information regarding spellbooks, writing spellbooks and travelling spellbooks, those sort of things. And that bit, to me, rivals the polearms as potentially being the best part of this book. So yes, there's enough in there to make Unearthed Arcana useful, certainly to my games. But a DM needed to be selective, because, as many have claimed over the years, it was also responsible for a shift in the tone and the balance of AD&D. And that is, in general, what dominates what I've picked out in my list of what was bad about it. Comeliness, as a stat, I think is unnecessary. It also had the potential to be overpowering. The book also brought in Drow Elves and Duergar as playable races, thus it normalised them. The Cavalier was an absolute juggernaut of a class, as was the Barbarian, and while these were balanced out by role-playing limitations, in my experience, certainly at that time when we were young, few players wanted to abide by them. They wanted all the good stuff and none of the bad stuff. Plus, if either of those two classes were played properly to the letter, they limited the options of the other players at the table. 2 of the new armour types, Field Plate and Full Plate, introduced the idea of damage absorption, which, while sensible in theory, in practice, when combined with other new options in the book, namely the Cavalier, severely impacted on the lethality of combat. Weapon specialisation was, as a result of all of this, necessary in order to bring the fighters back to being relevant. But in my opinion, it shouldn't have been available at first level, and that double speciality option was pushing it too far. Perhaps the most egregious part of the book, though, for me anyway, came at the start of the Dungeon Masters section, and that was Method 5, the new way of generating ability scores. It was intended for human PCs only, but that doesn't excuse it. For those who are unfamiliar, each class rolled a different number of dice for each stat using Method 5, and you'd keep the highest 3. A fighter, for example, would roll 9d6 and keep the 3 highest when generating strength. But if you still failed to get the stats to qualify for your chosen class, for example a monk with all their many 15s, you simply bump them up to the necessary minimum levels. It is my belief that the whole point of some of the more specialist classes, monk, bard, paladin, illusionist for example, was that they were meant to be rare and thus cherished. And most adventurers were supposed to belong to the core 4 classes: fighter, thief, cleric and magic user. But Method 5, if employed in the game, changed all of that. It simply made those rare classes much more normal. It made them more mundane. Along with the new races and classes and weapon specialisation, Method 5 also contributed to a serious shift in the power and the capability of the adventuring party. My final grumble, though, is about the new magic items. While having more to choose from is usually a good thing, because magic items are usually a great source of inspiration and ideas for plot hooks, again though, the power dynamics were shifting. Added to these lists, we had a lot more +3, +4 and +5 pieces of weapons and armour, and even some that were +6. And it also included magical versions of the already somewhat overpowered new armour types. Yes, if the tables were used strictly as written, the odds of getting some of these new items was very low. But, you know what kids are like. Want, without considering the repercussions. And in that last sentence, I highlight my biggest issue with the book as a whole. Due to the imbalanced nature of the options, it was all too easy for an inexperienced group to fully embrace it all and not understand the consequences of doing so. Certainly in the hands of a mature and experienced DM who is able to be sensible and selective with the new material, the book is fine. But for it to be presented as it was, with the foreword and the introductory text extolling the virtue of the contents, it was essentially released and let loose on the game. All games. And this brings me round to those claims about the material being thoroughly considered and tested. It can't have been. Otherwise the issues would have been spotted. Or maybe they were, and they didn't care. But wouldn't that be worse? But the editing issues for me back up my belief that the material was indeed untested, as the entire book feels rushed. The Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide had, for all their faults and for all their organisational eccentricities, they'd given the strong impression that they were labours of love. Unearthed Arcana does not. So what should a DM use from this book? Well, the correct answer is, of course, it's your game. Use whatever you want. But that's a cop-out of an answer. Personally, having used most of the material and used some of it in a recent game, this is how I would approach it now if I was to start a new campaign. I wouldn't touch Method 5 with a barge pole. I wouldn't roll randomly for magic items on the item tables. I would pick. And while I would allow weapon specialisation, it would not be available at first level, and there would be no double specialisation. I've seen the impact that has all too recently. As for the races and classes, I'd keep the Paladin as a subclass of fighter. I prefer it that way. I would allow the Cavalier as an available class should sufficient scores be rolled using the 4d6 rearrange method, the one I use. but I would now enforce the role-playing restrictions to the hilt. I'd remove the damage absorption properties of the new armour as well, and I would make it extremely rare, something that only the very greatest of blacksmiths could do, and the cost of it would be astronomical. As for the races, they're all setting dependent as far as I'm concerned. I have always made changes to available races in games, allowed some races and disallowed others, so I have no problem with stating that. Apart from the Drow and Duergar, they're always monsters. They will never be player characters in my games. Or maybe if I was doing a solely Underdark game with an evil tone to it. Possibly, but that's the only time. Gygax would soon be gone from TSR after this book was released, and second edition would be released 4 years later in 1989. It is rather telling to me that very little that appeared in Unearthed Arcana made it into the initial core second edition rulebooks. My overall verdict on Unearthed Arcana, well, as you might have gathered, I loved it when it was first released, but I have cooled on it in more recent years. It's a pity because there are some fine nuggets in there, but I simply cannot recommend it in its entirety to anyone who's going back and discovering first edition AD&D for the first time, and there are still people who are doing that. This is a book strictly for those who know what they are doing, who know what they want to achieve, and who are capable and confident enough to be highly selective and to say no. Well, that's been me, the old geek, once again giving you another opinion on something nostalgic. I hope you've enjoyed the video. I live stream on Wednesday nights. You're more than welcome to come along and have a chat. And for now, see ya.